you ever felt like your life is defined by pain, struggle, or limitations, like you were born into circumstances that seem impossible to escape? Perhaps you've carried the weight of a past filled with hardship, and it feels like no matter how hard you try, you can't break free from the chains that have held you down. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Jabez, a man whose very name meant sorrow, faced the same challenges. His life was destined to be marked by pain, yet in the midst of it all, he dared to pray a bold prayer, a prayer for blessing, for the enlargement of his territory, for protection from harm, and for deliverance from pain. Jabez didn't settle for the curse of his name. Instead, he cried out to God for a fresh start, believing that the God who created him had the power to rewrite his story. Today, we will explore how this powerful prayer can inspire us to break free from the limitations of our past and walk into the abundant life God has prepared for us. It's time to ask boldly and trust that our story can change, no matter where we've been or what we've faced. The story of Jabez is a profound reminder of the transformative power of prayer, especially when it is rooted in a deep, genuine desire for change. Jabez's life was marked by a name that carried a painful legacy, one filled with sorrow and hardship. His mother, who named him Jabez, did so in reference to the pain she endured during childbirth, as his name literally translates to sorrow or pain. From the very beginning of his life, Jabez was associated with suffering, an unfortunate consequence of his birth that was embedded in the very essence of his identity. In many cultures, names carry significant meaning, and Jabez's name seemed to predetermine a life filled with difficulty, misfortune, and sorrow. However, despite the weight of his name, Jabez chose a different path, a path marked by faith and the belief that God could rewrite his story. Jabez's story, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 4:9-10, reveals the incredible power of a simple but sincere prayer. Jabez did not accept the limitations imposed on him by his name or circumstances. Instead, he cried out to God for change, asking for blessings, for an expansion of his territory, for God's protection, and for deliverance from pain. His prayer was not a request based on self-interest alone, but a profound cry for a change in his destiny. This is an important aspect of Jabez's story. He recognized that his life was not bound by his name, his past, or the expectations of those around him. He understood that the God of Israel, the creator of the universe, had the power to alter the course of his life and change his story. The prayer was not merely about asking for material blessings. It was about seeking divine intervention that could break the cycle of pain and hardship that had defined his life up until that point. The prayer of Jabez is remarkable because it embodies the spirit of faith that can move mountains. Despite his painful beginnings, Jabez believed that God could change his circumstances. This is significant because it speaks to the role of faith in shaping our lives. Jabez could have accepted his fate, resigned to the belief that his pain and sorrow were inescapable. But instead, he reached out to God with faith, trusting that God could bring about change. The boldness of his request, asking God to enlarge his territory and bless him abundantly, shows that he had a vision for a life beyond his current circumstances. He wasn't asking for small changes or incremental improvements. He was asking for a transformation that would take him out of the shadow of sorrow and into a life of prosperity and influence. Furthermore, Jabez's prayer also speaks to the importance of understanding God's heart for us. Jabez did not pray a selfish prayer, asking solely for personal gain. Instead, he asked for God's blessings to overflow in such a way that his life would be marked by an expansion of influence and opportunity. His prayer is a model for how we can approach God with boldness, asking for his blessings not only for ourselves, but for the betterment of those around us. Jabez's heart was not just about overcoming personal struggle, but about seeing a greater purpose fulfilled through the blessings of God. This teaches us that the blessings of God are not meant to be hoarded or kept to ourselves, but are intended to have a ripple effect, impacting others in ways we may not even fully comprehend. What is also striking in Jabez's story is how quickly his prayer was answered. The Bible tells us that God granted his request. This immediate response from God emphasizes the power of sincere prayer and faith. It teaches us that when we approach God with a heart full of faith and a desire for change, God is ready and willing to respond. It also highlights that no matter what our past may look like, we can call upon God to transform our story, to turn our pain into purpose and our sorrow into joy. The story of Jabez is a story of redemption, of God's ability to change the trajectory of a life, no matter how dire the situation may seem. It is a reminder that our past does not define our future. Just as Jabez's name was a symbol of pain, his prayer became a symbol of divine intervention and transformation. Through his faith and bold request for change, Jabez experienced a complete turnaround in his life. A shift from sorrow to blessing, from limitation to expansion. The God who answered Jabez's prayer is the same God who can change our story today. Just as he changed Jabez's life, he can change ours, rewriting our history and transforming our future. The power of prayer for change is one of the most significant themes in the story of Jabez. Prayer is often seen as a means of communication with God, a way to express our needs, desires, and hopes. However, the story of Jabez shows us that prayer is not just about asking for things. It is about invoking divine power to intervene in the course of our lives. It is about stepping into a relationship with God where we express our faith in His ability to transform our situations. Jabez's prayer was simple, yet filled with profound faith and purpose. It wasn't a request made out of entitlement or selfish desire, but rather a desperate cry for change, a desire for something greater than the limitations his life had imposed on him. When Jabez prayed, he was not merely asking for things that would make his life easier or more comfortable. He was asking for a divine intervention that would fundamentally alter his destiny. He understood that true change does not come from relying on our own strength or effort, but from tapping into the limitless power of God. Jabez's prayer is an example of how we can pray with boldness and expectancy, believing that God can reshape the very fabric of our lives. His request was not small. It was not a wish for minor improvements. Instead, he asked for God's blessings to overflow in his life, to enlarge his territory, to protect him from harm, and to deliver him from pain. Each element of his prayer reflects the depth of his yearning for transformation in every area of his life. The prayer of Jabez teaches us that there is power in specific, heartfelt requests. He didn't offer a vague or generic prayer. He asked for tangible changes that would improve the quality of his life. First, he asked for God's blessing, recognizing that blessings come from God alone and that no amount of human effort could bring the kind of transformation he desired. In asking for his territory to be enlarged, Jabez was asking for more than just physical space or property. He was asking for an increase in his influence, his opportunities, and his potential. His prayer reflects a desire to break out of his small, limited existence and to step into a broader, more abundant life, one marked by prosperity and influence. This shows us that we are not to settle for a life that merely meets our needs, but to ask God for an expanded vision for our lives, one that goes beyond personal survival and embraces the greater plans He has for us. Moreover, Jabez's prayer was a prayer for protection. He specifically asked God to keep him from harm and pain, recognizing that life's challenges and struggles can often prevent us from reaching our fullest potential. Jabez's request for protection was not just a physical plea for safety, but a holistic request that covered emotional, spiritual, and mental well-being. In a world filled with uncertainty and adversity, Jabez's prayer encourages us to seek God's protection from the forces that seek to derail us, whether they are external challenges or internal struggles. His plea was for God to guard him against the things that could cause him pain, and in doing so, he acknowledged that it was only through God's grace and protection that he could hope to live a life free from the cycles of suffering and limitation. In addition to this, Jabez's prayer was an act of surrender. By praying for God to change his story, he was acknowledging that his past did not define his future. Jabez understood that he could not overcome the limitations imposed by his name or his circumstances on his own. He needed God's intervention to break the chains that bound him and to take him into a future filled with hope and promise. This is a crucial aspect of prayer for change, recognizing that we cannot transform our lives on our own. Jabez surrendered his future to God, trusting that God's plan for him was greater than any setback he had faced in the past. Through this act of surrender, he opened himself up to God's divine will, ready to receive whatever change God had in store for him. The power of prayer for change is also reflected in the fact that God answered Jabez's prayer. The Bible tells us that God granted his request, showing us that when we approach God with a heart full of faith and a desire for transformation, He is faithful to respond. Prayer is not a one-sided conversation where we merely express our desires. It is an invitation for God to move in our lives in ways that we may not fully understand. When Jabez prayed for change, he wasn't just speaking empty words. He was exercising faith in God's ability to reshape his life. This is what makes prayer so powerful. The belief that God can and will act on our behalf, answering our prayers in ways that are beyond our comprehension. Ultimately, Jabez's prayer highlights that prayer is not about asking for trivial things or personal gain alone. It is about reaching out to God with faith, believing that He has the power to radically change our circumstances. Jabez's prayer was a cry for divine intervention, for a new path to be carved out of his pain and suffering. It teaches us that prayer, when rooted in faith and genuine need, can unlock the doors of possibility and transformation. It is through such prayer that God's power becomes real in our lives, changing our stories and opening the doors to a future filled with hope, blessing, and purpose. The story of Jabez serves as a powerful reminder of God's ability to break curses and transform lives, no matter how deeply rooted the negative circumstances may seem. Jabez's life was initially marked by a name that symbolized pain and sorrow. His mother named him Jabez because of the pain she endured during childbirth. In many cultures, names carry significant weight and can often shape a person's identity, reputation, and even destiny. Jabez's name was no exception. It was an unfortunate label that carried with it a legacy of suffering. The Bible's brief mention of Jabez could lead us to believe that he was destined to live a life defined by sorrow, bound by the curse of his name. However, his prayer to God highlights an essential truth. God can break any curse, dismantle any negative inheritance, and free us from the patterns of pain that have been passed down to us. Jabez's bold prayer for change reveals the power of God to interrupt the trajectory of a life that might otherwise be bound by circumstances or generational patterns. He didn't accept the identity that his name had imposed upon him. Instead, he sought God's intervention, asking for his blessings, for an expansion of his territory, and for protection from pain and harm. Jabez understood that even though his name was a symbol of pain, God was not limited by the labels or curses that society, family, or history had placed on him. He recognized that the God he served had the power to rewrite his story, regardless of the negative legacy he had inherited. One of the key elements in Jabez's prayer is the recognition that God is not bound by the limitations of our past. Jabez's plea was not only a request for personal blessing, but a cry for deliverance from the curse that his name represented. He didn't let his past or his painful beginnings dictate his future. Instead, he chose to believe that God could break the curse of his name, setting him free from the shadow of sorrow that had followed him. This is an important lesson for all of us. God's ability to break curses is not dependent on our circumstances, but on His sovereign will. When we seek God's intervention, He has the power to break generational cycles of failure, poverty, addiction, or any other destructive pattern that may have been passed down to us. The concept of curses is a difficult one, but it's vital to understand that they can manifest in various forms, often through negative patterns in our lives. These patterns may include repeated failures, financial struggles, broken relationships, or even health issues that seem to run through generations. Sometimes these cycles are not only the result of personal choices, but also a result of spiritual forces at work. Forces that try to keep us bound to negative patterns from our past. However, when we approach God in prayer, asking Him to break the chains of these curses, we open ourselves to the transformative power of His grace and deliverance. Jabez's story is an illustration of how prayer can bring about the reversal of generational curses. His request for God's blessing and protection was not just about him. It was an intercession for the removal of the pain that had marked his family's history. In his prayer, Jabez acknowledged the power of God to break free from the past and to create a new future. God responded to Jabez's prayer, not because he was entitled to it, but because his faith opened the door for God to act on his behalf. The act of seeking God's help to break curses is not about focusing on the negative aspects of our past, but about looking toward God's redemptive power to rewrite our story. The beauty of God's intervention in Jabez's life is that it was not just a temporary change, but a complete transformation. God's blessings were not just physical, they were holistic, affecting every aspect of his life. When God answered Jabez's prayer, He didn't just enlarge his territory in a material sense. He expanded his opportunities, his influence, and his potential. This serves as a reminder that when God breaks the curses in our lives, He doesn't just remove the negative influences. He also fills us with new purpose, new opportunities, and new possibilities. God's intervention brings a total transformation, shifting us from a place of suffering to one of abundance and blessing. Jabez's story challenges us to recognize that no matter what curses or negative patterns we have inherited, whether they are emotional, relational, or financial, God is powerful enough to break them. When we come to God with faith, just as Jabez did, we are tapping into a power that is far greater than any generational curse. God's grace is sufficient to overcome every obstacle and to bring about a new beginning. Our past, no matter how painful, does not have to define our future. With God's help, we can step into a new chapter, one that is free from the curses of our past and filled with the blessings of His grace. Through Jabez's prayer, we are reminded that God is a God who changes stories, who breaks curses, and who rewrites destinies. No matter how deep the pain or how entrenched the negative patterns may seem, God is always able to change our story. He is a God of redemption, always ready to intervene and turn our pain into purpose. Just as He answered Jabez's prayer, He is ready to answer ours, breaking the curses that have bound us and leading us into a life of blessing and favor. The role of faith in transformation is deeply exemplified in the story of Jabez, whose life was radically changed through his belief that God could intervene in his circumstances. Jabez's prayer is a profound example of how faith can unlock the transformative power of God in our lives. At the heart of Jabez's prayer is the boldness and conviction that God is capable of changing his life, no matter how bleak his situation may have seemed. Jabez didn't just pray out of desperation. He prayed with an unwavering belief in God's ability to break the patterns of his life and grant him the blessings he sought. This is crucial because faith is not just about asking for change. It is about believing that change is possible and that God has the power to make it happen. The act of faith demonstrated in Jabez's prayer is significant because it was a rejection of the limitations imposed upon him by his name and his past. He was aware of the painful history tied to his birth, the sorrow his mother had endured, and the curse that came with his name. Despite this, Jabez chose to believe that his future was not defined by the circumstances of his birth or the negative legacy that seemed to follow him. He didn't accept his fate, nor did he allow the pain of his past to shape his vision for the future. Instead, he chose to exercise faith in God, knowing that God's power could break the cycles of pain and lead him to a new destiny. This faith, born from a deep trust in God's goodness and ability, became the catalyst for the transformation Jabez experienced. In Jabez's prayer, there is a profound confidence that God can do exceedingly beyond what one might expect or imagine. He asked God for blessings, for the enlargement of his territory, for protection, and for deliverance from pain. These requests were not small or insignificant. They were requests for complete transformation. Jabez wasn't merely asking for minor improvements in his life, but for a complete reversal of his circumstances. This boldness in asking reflects the kind of faith that moves mountains. It wasn't about asking God for just enough to get by, but for an abundance that would change the trajectory of his life. This level of faith requires a deep understanding of the nature of God, that he is not limited by the constraints of our human understanding, and that his ability to bless and transform far exceeds anything we could ever imagine. Jabez's prayer highlights that faith is not just about believing that God can change our situation, but also about believing that God will change it. This kind of faith involves an element of trust in God's timing and his will. It requires letting go of doubts and fears, which often prevent us from fully embracing the changes God has in store for us. Faith in transformation is not passive. It requires active belief in God's promises and an unshakable conviction that he is working in our lives, even when we cannot see immediate results. The fact that Jabez's prayer was answered shows that faith is not only about making requests, but also about trusting that God will respond in his way and in his timing. Faith in transformation also involves recognizing the power of God to change us from the inside out. Jabez's prayer was not just for external blessings or material gains. He sought internal change, asking God to keep him from harm and pain. This demonstrates that true transformation isn't just about changing our circumstances, but about transforming our hearts, minds, and spirits. It's about seeking God's intervention to heal our wounds, free us from the pain of our past, and grant us a new identity. One that is rooted in his blessings and not in the scars of previous struggles. This deeper level of transformation requires faith not only in God's ability to change our circumstances, but also in his desire to make us whole. The fact that God answered Jabez's prayer underscores the connection between faith and transformation. When Jabez prayed, he believed that God was listening, that God had the power to act, and that God would act on his behalf. His faith opened the door for God to intervene in his life, and God responded by granting his requests. This teaches us that when we approach God with faith, we are not just hoping for a better future. We are actively inviting God to work in our lives. God honors faith because faith demonstrates trust in His ability and willingness to bring about change. It's through faith that we give God permission to act in our lives and transform our situations. Faith is the bridge that connects our present reality with the transformation God has promised. Just as Jabez believed that God could change his life, we must believe that God can change ours. Faith enables us to step into the fullness of God's potential for us, despite the limitations or challenges that may seem insurmountable. Jabez's life is a testimony to the fact that no matter how impossible our circumstances may seem, faith in God's ability to transform and elevate our lives opens the door to divine intervention and blessings beyond measure. Through his unwavering belief, Jabez was able to break free from the sorrow of his past and step into a life of divine favor. His story challenges us to embrace the transformative power of faith in our own lives, trusting that God can and will reshape our destiny when we approach Him with boldness and confidence. The concept of enlarging one's territory is a central aspect of Jabez's prayer and represents a significant desire for growth and expansion in both physical and spiritual aspects of life. In asking God to enlarge his territory, Jabez was not simply requesting an increase in material wealth or land, but a broader influence and expansion of opportunities and a greater capacity to make an impact. This plea is not just about personal gain. It's about opening oneself to greater possibilities, stepping into a larger vision for life, and fulfilling a higher calling. The prayer for enlarged territory is a call for believers to aim beyond the limitations of their current circumstances, to think expansively, and to trust God for opportunities that go beyond the ordinary or expected. When Jabez asked for his territory to be enlarged, he was asking for more influence, more opportunity, and more potential to accomplish God's will in his life. The enlargement of territory in Jabez's prayer represents a desire to expand the scope of one's influence and to have a life that extends beyond the narrow confines of one's current state. It was an acknowledgement that God's blessings are not limited and that His plans for us involve an abundant life far beyond what we may currently understand. In essence, Jabez was asking God to take him out of the limitations imposed by his background, his name, and his history, and to grant him the opportunity to step into a life of influence, success, and fulfillment. This notion challenges individuals to broaden their own vision for what is possible, urging them to believe that God's blessings can extend beyond the current reality and into realms of possibility they may have never considered. Enlarging one's territory also speaks to the concept of taking on greater responsibility. It's not simply about getting more for oneself, but about becoming a vessel that can handle greater blessings and opportunities. The larger territory that Jabez asked for also meant that he was willing to carry more responsibility and to impact more people. With greater influence and opportunity come greater challenges, but they also come with the potential for greater rewards. Jabez's request reflects a readiness to step into the larger purpose God has for him. It is an invitation for us to take on the responsibilities that come with success and growth. To ask for expanded territory is to ask God for the capacity to handle greater things, not just for personal enjoyment, but for the benefit of others and for God's glory. It involves an openness to the work that comes with increased opportunities, a willingness to trust that God will equip us for the journey ahead. The concept of territory can also be viewed as a spiritual one. It speaks to the expansion of one's faith, the deepening of one's relationship with God, and the growth of spiritual influence in the world. Just as Jabez sought physical and material blessings, his prayer also calls us to seek spiritual expansion. Enlarging one's territory can mean deepening one's faith and trust in God, broadening one's understanding of His will, and becoming more involved in His mission. It involves seeking the kind of influence that brings others closer to God, expanding the reach of His message, and being a conduit for His work in the world. It's a request for more opportunities to serve, to minister, and to live out the calling that God has placed on one's life. Jabez's prayer shows that territory is not just about physical space, but also about spiritual influence and impact. Another important aspect of enlarging one's territory is the idea of embracing God's will for one's life in its entirety. It's easy to become complacent with what is comfortable and familiar, but Jabez's prayer is a reminder to step out in faith and trust God to lead us into new territories, even when they are unknown and require stepping out of our comfort zones. Envisioning expanded territory often means facing challenges that push us to grow in ways we may not have anticipated. It calls for courage to leave behind old ways of thinking and to embrace new opportunities that may seem daunting at first. Jabez's plea for enlarged territory calls us to step into the larger purposes God has for us, knowing that He will be with us every step of the way, equipping us with what we need to succeed. In a broader sense, enlarging one's territory can be seen as an invitation to break free from the limitations of fear, insecurity, or doubt. Often, people limit themselves based on past failures, current circumstances, or a fear of the unknown. The prayer of Jabez challenges these limitations by asking for God's hand to enlarge what we may feel is too small or too limited. This is an act of boldness, acknowledging that God's power is far greater than any obstacle that might stand in our way. When Jabez prayed for his territory to be enlarged, he was declaring that his future was not going to be limited by his past, by the pain he had experienced, or by the expectations placed upon him by others. He was stepping into a broader vision, one that was defined not by human limitations, but by the expansive possibilities that God had in store for him. Ultimately, enlarging one's territory is about living a life that reflects God's abundance and His plans for us. It's about refusing to settle for mediocrity or small thinking and instead asking God for a greater, more fulfilling life. Jabez's prayer is an encouragement to expand our thinking, to ask God for more than what we think we deserve, and to trust that He will provide the opportunities, resources, and strength needed to handle the larger life He has in mind for us. By asking God for His blessings and for an enlargement of our territory, we are stepping out in faith and preparing ourselves for the abundance that He desires to pour into our lives. Jabez's prayer for deliverance from pain is one of the most profound aspects of his plea to God. It speaks to a deep yearning for freedom from the cycles of suffering, hardship, and emotional wounds that can define a person's life. Pain in many forms has the power to shape our experiences, influence our decisions, and even dictate how we see the world. Jabez's request for deliverance from pain was not just about a desire for relief from physical suffering, but also a plea for freedom from the emotional, mental, and spiritual pain that had defined much of his existence. His prayer was a cry for God to intervene in the deepest parts of his life and heal him from the lasting effects of the sorrow that his name and his life had brought him. The significance of Jabez's prayer for deliverance from pain lies in the fact that it was a very personal and specific request. He understood the weight of pain in his life. His name, which meant sorrow or pain, was not merely a label, but a constant reminder of the hardship his mother experienced during childbirth and the pain that, for all intents and purposes, seemed to follow him. In asking God to deliver him from this pain, Jabez was not only seeking to break free from the emotional and psychological burden that came with his name, but also to release himself from the generational and spiritual ties to that pain. By calling on God, he was acknowledging that he could not free himself from the effects of his past on his own. He needed divine intervention to break the chains that pain had forged in his life. This request for deliverance shows us that God is concerned not only with our external circumstances, but with the internal wounds that we carry. Pain, in many ways, becomes a part of who we are if it is not addressed. Jabez's plea for deliverance acknowledges that God is able to heal the deep, hidden wounds in our lives that often go unnoticed by others. These wounds, whether caused by personal experiences, betrayal, rejection, or loss, can leave lasting scars that shape our identity and how we approach life. In praying for deliverance, Jabez recognized that true healing and transformation require God's intervention at the deepest level of the heart. Moreover, Jabez's prayer for freedom from pain speaks to the healing power of God's grace. Pain, whether physical or emotional, can often make us feel isolated, trapped in a cycle of suffering that seems unending. Jabez's prayer, however, reminds us that God has the power to break that cycle and restore peace where there has been turmoil. Deliverance from pain does not simply mean the absence of suffering. It means the restoration of wholeness. It means that God can take the broken pieces of our lives and heal them, bringing peace and comfort where there was once distress. This act of deliverance is not a temporary fix. It is a deep, transformative healing that changes the way we live and see the world. When Jabez asks for deliverance from pain, he is also asking for a new beginning, free from the shackles of his past. Pain has a way of holding us captive, defining who we are and limiting who we can become. It becomes difficult to move forward when we are constantly reminded of the pain we have experienced. But Jabez's prayer is a declaration that his past does not have to define his future. By seeking God's deliverance, he is choosing to trust in God's ability to reshape his story, to take him out of the cycle of suffering, and to give him a new identity that is no longer bound by the pain of his past. This act of seeking deliverance is an act of faith. It shows that Jabez believed God could bring him into a life that was free from the burdens that had weighed him down. The request for deliverance from pain also reveals a deep spiritual truth. God cares about the emotional and spiritual well-being of his people. Pain can be a powerful force that affects not only our physical health, but also our mental and emotional states. It can lead to feelings of hopelessness, depression, and despair, causing us to retreat inwardly and withdraw from the people around us. Jabez's prayer shows us that God is not distant from our pain. He is near to us in our suffering and is willing to intervene on our behalf. By asking God for deliverance, Jabez was reaching out to a God who understands our pain and is ready to heal and restore us. Deliverance from pain is also a call to freedom. When we experience emotional or spiritual pain, we often become trapped by it, carrying it with us wherever we go. It affects our relationships, our decisions, and how we view the world. Jabez's prayer for freedom from pain was an acknowledgement that he could not break free from the chains of his past on his own. He needed God to release him from the hold that pain had over him, so he could step into the fullness of the life God had for him. It is a reminder that God offers us freedom, not just from physical afflictions, but from the emotional and spiritual burdens that keep us from living fully. This freedom allows us to embrace a life of purpose and peace, unburdened by the weight of past hurts and wounds. Ultimately, Jabez's prayer for deliverance from pain is a reminder of the holistic healing that God offers. He is not just concerned with our physical well-being, but with our entire being, body, mind, and spirit. God's deliverance is comprehensive. It touches every part of our lives and brings wholeness where there was once brokenness. In praying for deliverance, Jabez invited God to remove the barriers that pain had placed in his life and to lead him into a life of peace, joy, and fulfillment. This is the power of God's grace. He is able to heal and restore us in ways that we cannot do on our own, bringing us into a place of freedom and wholeness. Through Jabez's prayer, we are reminded that no matter how deep the pain, God's healing power can bring deliverance and transformation. In conclusion, the prayer of Jabez serves as a powerful reminder of the transformative power of God in our lives. Through his simple yet profound prayer, Jabez exemplifies the importance of faith, boldness, and trust in God's ability to change our circumstances. Jabez's plea for blessing, enlargement of territory, protection, and deliverance from pain speaks to the deepest desires of the human heart. Desires for healing, growth, opportunity, and freedom. His story challenges us to reach beyond the limitations of our past, to step into the fullness of God's promises, and to believe that no matter what our circumstances may be, God can rewrite our story. Through prayer, faith, and a willingness to surrender our pain and limitations to God, we open ourselves to a life of abundance, transformation, and purpose. Thank you for taking the time to reflect on Jabez's prayer and its powerful lessons for our own lives. May you find the courage to boldly ask God for the blessings you need, to trust Him for the transformation you desire, and to believe that He can and will change your story. Good luck as you walk forward in faith, and may you experience the fullness of God's grace and favor in every area of your life. Stay blessed.